Hello everyone, I'd like to welcome you all to the Chartered Institute of Linguists webinar, Translating for the International Development Sector, presented by Karen Stokes. My name is Sahela Phillips and I'm the Events and Networks Manager. During this webinar, you can ask questions by posting them on the questions panel, which is just to the right of your screen. Then at the end of Karen's presentation, the Q&A session will follow. All attendees will receive a certificate and a link to the recording within 2 working days. And CIOL members, you can log this on My CPD. But for now, I'd like to welcome our speaker. Hi, Karen.
Hi, Sahela.
Hello there. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to pass controls over to you so you can begin, and I will confirm when we can see your slides.
Okay.
That's great. We can see them.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Lovely. Okay. Let's make a start. So first of all, I'd just like to say thanks first to CIL and specifically to Sahela for all her work and help getting this set up. It's a real pleasure for me to have the opportunity to talk on this topic. As some of you will know, I've had a fairly long involvement with CIOL as committee member and chair of council, and having had taken a little break, it's very nice to be involved once again. This is a topic I find really fascinating and rewarding. It makes up quite a substantial part of my work, and I'm just aiming to share today some of my experience as part of that peer-to-peer learning process, which is something I think CIOL does really well. So just to give you a flavour of what I do, I've been translating now for around 20 years, and about 15 of those I've been working in this sector. I translate from French to English, and for historical reasons, it therefore means that quite a lot of the work I do in this area is for countries in West Africa. I mainly work for specialist language service providers contracted to international organisations, and that's one of the sources of work we'll talk about a little bit later on. My key areas of work are in public health and disease control, particularly around AIDS, tuberculosis, TB and malaria. I do a fair bit of work too in water, sanitation and hygiene. The acronym WASH is something you'll come across in this sector. And I have a particular interest in the empowerment of women and girls and human rights around that group of people. And probably a final area, in fact, I'm working on this morning, as it happens, is in food insecurity. As we'll see later on, all of these areas are linked, and it's maybe just worth keeping in mind the visual at the top of this slide this morning is that so many areas in international development run alongside each other, but also interconnect, and interconnectedness is going to be a key theme that we're going to talk about today. My work consists very much of things like funding applications, project reports, monitoring and evaluation reports, so often internally focused documents within those larger organisations, but also some public facing work, press releases and web copy and that sort of thing, putting some of those results into language that's probably more suitable for the general public. I've aimed my talk this morning probably slightly more at people not already working in the sector, but even if you already are, I hope there'll be something of interest, particularly around your own professional development. I've found it useful at various times to step back from the document in front of me and just look at the sector at a more conceptual level, particularly with some academic input, and I think that can be useful when it comes to thinking about how you write for development professionals, which is really the business we're in this sector. Okay, a little bit of a hiccup there with changing the slides, but hopefully that's fine. So just to take you briefly through the structure of today's webinar, I'll going to start by talking about what we mean by international development and go on to talk about how you build initial subject expertise in this field if it's a new one to you. I've touched on the fact already, and I'll talk more about the fact that it's a very wide-ranging and interconnected sector, and therefore finding your niche within that is quite important, because as with everything, we can't be experts in every aspect of every field. I'll talk a little bit about how we stay abreast of new developments in the field and how you hone your language, your target language skills when you're writing for other international development professionals. I'll also be touching on sources of work and some of the characteristic features of the documents you'll be translating. I'll cover some terminological resources, really as a launch pad for you to do further research into resources that you'll find useful. I'll touch briefly on role played by translation technologies. And I'll talk about some of the rewards and challenges of translating this sector. And as Sahela mentioned, there should be time for a few questions at the end. So if you just type into the chat box, and Sahela will put as many to me as she can, I'm sure. So to begin, what do we mean by the term international development? I guess as translators, we should always define our terms. It's a term that emerged in the 20th century, and it tends to refer to interventions by rich, developed countries, and I use those terms slightly in inverted commas, mainly in Europe and North America, what we might now refer to as the global north. And those interventions were aimed at, still are aimed at, so-called poor and developing countries, so mainly in Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and Central and South America, which we would now refer to as the global south. It's perhaps worth noting that nuance in rich/poor and developed/developing. But the underlying assumption in the early stages of this was that progress and prosperity for everybody came through economic growth, through technological innovation, and through industrialization. So, as I've said, these interventions are intentional, intended to support human development, and focusing on issues such as poverty and the things that stem from that. So, for example, a lack of access to healthcare facilities, or to education, or to basic services such as water and sanitation, but a whole range of other areas as well. So just to take a few, I mentioned earlier disease control and health systems strengthening. That's a phrase you'll come across, and it refers to the sort of building capacity within the health system of a country so that it can provide proper preventive and curative treatment to its population. But we'll also, we might cover areas such as empowerment, so helping people, particularly minority or vulnerable groups, to exercise their civil and political rights. It can involve infrastructure development. It can improve governance, or addressing income and gender inequalities. Reducing food insecurity was one of the things I mentioned a little bit earlier. And also creating opportunities for entrepreneurship to support income generating activities so that populations can help themselves. That might include improving access to finance, for example, through microcredit organisations. Another aspect might be the development of technological solutions, such as solar lamps or cleaner cooking stoves, things like that. So you'll already be getting a flavour, I hope, of the fact that this is a vast area with lots of interconnected elements to it. Some of the key actors involved would be state actors such as national development agencies such as USAID, what was the Department for International Development in the UK before the merger with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. We also see involvement of international organisations, so things like UN agencies such as the United Nations Development Programme, or UN Women, UN AIDS, things like that. the World Bank, the World Health Organization, of which we've all become much more aware, I'm sure, in the last few years. But as well as that, regional organisations such as economic communities and regional development banks, and also non-governmental organisations, NGOs, and civil society organisations, CSOs. All of those actors will be involved at their different levels in these development interventions. This sector can also lead you into a lot of other areas. So environmental issues such as deforestation and land use. Climate change is a very obvious one that's affecting us at the moment. Climate justice, migration, but also things such as transparency initiatives. You may be aware of the Practice What You Pay campaign about transparency in the extractive industries, so mining of minerals and so forth in countries that have a wealth of those resources and how they're remunerated. But also another example might be human rights, so issues such as early marriage or child labour or female genital mutilation, for example. All of those areas that you may come across when working in this sector. It goes without saying that interventions of this kind require significant funding through official development assistance and donations to funding organisations. A lot of work comes from funding applications, and value for money is critical. So you'll be writing reports around project planning, how a project was implemented, how it was then monitored and evaluated so that lessons can be learned for future programmes, and so on and so forth. Just staying with terminology for a moment, I just want to touch on the phrase global development, which we're seeing more and more as part of the recognition of the need to think about development in global terms. All countries are affected by and need to collaborate in addressing the serious issues we face in the 21st century. So something like climate change, as we've all seen, the coronavirus pandemic, the war in Ukraine and its knock-on effects are not solved by top-down development interventions, but they affect us all. And part of that is sustainable development, which again, I'm sure you'll have heard about frequently if you follow this sort of sector, and the Sustainable Development Goals. So sustainable development was defined, I think, first in 1987. The Brundtland report called Our Common Future defined it as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So that's really about reconciling economic growth with social and environmental protection. And insofar as it talks about meeting our own needs and not compromising the needs of the future, there's both an intragenerational fairness about that, so within the current generation, but also an intergenerational fairness around looking after future generations. And something you're going to come across a lot in this sector are the Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted in 2015, took over from the Millennium Development Goals, and they're a core part of the so-called 2030 agenda. There are 17 goals and 169 targets and lots of actions associated with them. And there's a huge amount of information available about them, so I won't go into a lot of detail now, but just to give you a flavour, if I take the first few SDGs, no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation. I think that's about the first half dozen, but others look at energy, at work, at responsible consumption, at climate action, at life below water, life on land, and lots of other things as well. I think they're a very useful reference point when thinking about this sector, so I'd urge you to do some reading around those. So within this vast sector, how do you build some initial expertise or move into other areas if you're already working part of the sector? I think there is a real value in gaining a broad understanding of the sector if you're coming to it for the first time, but also if you're already working in it, because it gives you the chance to take a step back, think about the specific area you're working in and how that fits with the broader field. And the reasons I say that is because actually having that real understanding makes you a better translator. It gives you a chance to absorb language used in the wider field. It may open doors to other areas of interest. And last but not least, it's really interesting. And I think that's a really important part of our working lives. Actually, if we can be interested in what we do, then that's a real pleasure and a privilege, I think. There is absolutely no shortage of options for getting started in this field. So I've just listed a very small number of things here that might prove a useful starting point and a launch pad to take you to other things. So to start, a couple of examples from the Open University's Open Learn programme, and I've chosen these deliberately because you can access them anytime and they're free of charge if you register with the OU. So a couple there, Understanding International Development and Introducing Global Development, very good for just an overview of the sector really, and some of the themes that are current within it. You'll probably also be familiar with Coursera and FutureLearn as online learning platforms. So one from Coursera there that I've mentioned towards Agenda 2030, another from UEA, which is the university down the road from me, Waters International Development, which is hosted on FutureLearn. Again, free and paid options there as to whether you want to get a certificate and so forth for it. But actually, as well as those introductory courses, both of those platforms run some really interesting courses. So Duke University, these are all on Coursera, the ones I'm going to mention now, on the challenges of global health, one on strengthening health systems, another on international women's health and human rights. So lots and lots of things that you could pursue there. I'd highly recommend looking at the Sustainable Development Goals website within the United Nations. Really good starting point and a very excellent terminological resource insofar as far as I can see, nearly all the material is available in all the UN official languages. So French, English, Spanish, Russian, Chinese and Arabic, absolute wealth of information there that you can make use of. If you're interested in the sort of current research projects, then the Columbia Center for Sustainable Development has all sorts of useful materials that you can read up about and some publications. That's part of the Earth Institute there. A source I particularly like is the Sustainable Development Academy, available on its own website or through edX. Again, free, open source courses and resources, self-paced, some really excellent people on there. One course that I took quite a long time ago now is The Age of Sustainable Development by Jeffrey Sachs, who's a very key figure in this sector, and it was life-changing actually. Really, really interesting course. But you can also just choose to work on courses that focus on particular goals if you want to pursue a certain topic. There's Centre for Global Development, again, great source of research and policy papers and briefs. It has blogs, it has podcasts, and it has events, especially a series of talks, some of which are broader and some a little bit more specialised. So they've just done one on food insecurity amidst pandemic and war, for example. So some interesting things there too. And a slightly more specialised source, if you're interested in global health, would be the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. They offer quite a number of free online courses, but also the option to study and delve a little bit deeper so MSc courses there, but also at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, who do various postgraduate courses in sustainable development and climate change. The University of Sussex has something. Again, there are lots and lots of things. So if you want to go down that route, there are lots and lots of ways of doing it, and sort of going into this at whichever level you choose to. Coming back to the sort of reward, but also the challenge of this being such a wide-ranging sector, it can feel, I think, a little bit overwhelming at the beginning in terms of thinking, well, how do I fit within this? There are inevitably going to be some geographical and linguistic considerations. As I've said, I work from French to English. I might find a really fascinating NGO in South America, but the chances are I'm not going to be able to work for them because I don't have the language to support that. So that will be driven largely by you. I think it's always worth sort of doing an assessment of your existing knowledge and seeing what you know already, because that might provide a starting point for deciding which field you'd like to go into in this sector, but also personal interest. I think that's incredibly important for motivation and for continued learning. I've always said when speaking to translators, you do, as you know, you spend all day with these texts, and it's much more interesting if it's something you find really fascinating, and as I say, gives you plenty of opportunities for doing more learning as well. I think if you're at the very beginning of this journey, you know, a suggested starting point would be to take one of the Sustainable Development Goals, and I've just picked an example slightly at random here, SDG 6, which is all about clean water and sanitation, and it's quite easy to see the interconnectedness of that. So you might start working on wash, water, sanitation and hygiene type projects, but it's fairly easy to see how that takes you into something, an area such as good health and well-being. It's very clear that a lack of access to clear water and sanitation impacts on health. It could link perhaps slightly less obviously to gender equality, but if you bear in mind that women and girls often bear responsibility for water collection, and they're in a vulnerable position if they are in a situation of practicing open defecation, then clearly there is a link to gender equality there. It's quite clear also, if we look at, say, SDG 14, life below water, that discharging untreated sewage and untreated wastewater into waterways will have adverse environmental consequences. So you begin to see how you start in one particular field, but it may begin to take you into others. And I think that can be really interesting. And I'm sure you can work out for yourself how those other SDGs might link back to SDG 6. As with every sector in translation, change is happening all the time. So it pays to be on top of what's happening and staying abreast of new developments. And some of the suggestions some of the courses I listed under building your initial subject knowledge I think are very useful, but they're quite broad, and inevitably course development time means they can get out of date relatively quickly. So I think it's useful to balance that with some more immediate sources, and I've given you a few examples here. And most of these are quite short form writing, relatively short articles, research papers and so forth, but still really valuable for keeping your knowledge and your terminology up to date and understanding the trends that are taking place in your particular field. So I mentioned earlier that one of the areas I work in is disease control, including around malaria. So the Gates Foundation, really interesting, lots and lots of really useful information on there. Published an article just within the last week about a new type of bed net for keeping off mosquitoes. It's probably 10 to 15 minute read, up-to-date information, really rich source of terminology. So actually that 10 to 15 minutes then usefully became a slightly longer period, pulling the terminology out of that and building that into glossaries and so forth. So really great way of staying up to date. Another source of articles is the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Again, nicely divided articles into what they call insights and deep dives. So obviously those go into a bit more detail. Articles they call explainers, so sort of taking research but putting it into plain English, which is quite helpful for those of us who are not at the academic end of this, and policy analysis and so forth. Another site I enjoy is called The Conversation. I don't know if you've come across it, but its byline is academic rigour and journalistic flair. And one of the reasons I like it is, again, it's up to date, it's well written by academics, and you know their affiliation. So you can also see where funding comes from for a particular article, which again is very useful in terms of transparency, I think. So quite a lot around international and sustainable development on there. Social media feeds from relevant organisations, probably the prime way of staying completely up to date within minutes, and a well curated feed I think is really helpful. If you know my website at all, I am not at all an active user of social media. I post very little, but I do read a lot, and I find a lot of useful links, which sometimes I will share. So just to take an example, we are currently in World Water Week. So the Water Aid feed has details of something like 25 online discussions and links to other resources. There's certainly material to be found in the regular press, but also in specialist journals. One I know quite well is the Forced Migration Review, published by Oxford. Again, very useful insofar as it publishes in English, French, Spanish and Arabic. Yes, it focuses on forced migration, but it has other it will look at other aspects as well. So it's done issues on climate crisis and displacement, public health and so forth. Also, quite a lot of those articles are available as audio recordings if you want to mix up your learning a little bit rather than just reading. So that's great. And I've just listed a couple of sources of podcasts and blogs from the London International Development Centre. You could go and have a look at those, but there are literally hundreds. I lost count when looking. So again, I think it's a matter of finding your way through to find blogs and podcasts, particularly for the sector you're particularly interested in. I think what is possibly becoming clear is that the potential issue here is not in any way a shortage of resources, but a potentially overwhelming array. I could spend my day just reading and listening to things, but actually have to do some work as well. So you do have to be a little bit selective and really focus on things that are really relevant to what you're doing. I said at the beginning I touch a little bit on sources of work, and I think that the first couple of those are fairly obvious, to be honest. There are certainly specialist language service providers, as well as some who for whom it's a part of their work, but not the key part. And again, possibly focusing in different areas of the world and different languages, but relatively easily found. And I do know people who work quite successfully for NGOs. Again, I think that's for you to research. It's not something I do particularly. I think it's something for you to research for yourself based on your language combination and the fields that you're interested in. I have on once or twice got involved in tendering for work with a group of other translators for national development agencies. And that can be perfectly successful. You can come together as a group to do that. What I would say is it's really important you've got very, very good records. I was quite surprised when I did it, just the level of detail that needed to be provided about previous work, but also the financials associated with that. So having really good data that you can then easily organise and put into a format that's suitable for a tender is really important. I've put funding organisations there, although if I'm honest, I think it's most likely that the really big funders actually will have their translations done through larger organisations such as LSPs. But again, there may be scope for setting up a consortium with other people and submitting tenders for that. The types of work I've mentioned earlier, so lots of reports, lots of funding applications, press releases, books, bits of website copy, and so on and so forth. And I think it's just worth giving a little bit of thought to the characteristic features of those texts. So the one that strikes me most is they tend to be very high volume. And I'm talking documents that run to tens of thousands of words. So really, really quite substantial pieces of work. They tend to make extensive use of acronyms. And so it's worth giving some thought as to how you handle those, how much you use them. Very useful in lots of ways in terms of keeping the volume of the text a little bit shorter, but potentially also very, very hard to read. It can make quite a clumsy read. Inevitably, your client will often give you guidance as to how to handle them. But I think it's worth thinking through for yourself too, particularly around that question of readability. Very often I find that reports and so forth I'm working on are based on templates. So really important to make sure that you have got the right templates because these are not things that should be retranslated. Occasionally that can cause a little bit of frustration if you think, well, they're not particularly how I would choose to put it, but the template is the template. So it's absolutely critical that you follow those. And as I've mentioned in a little while, this is where the translation technologies can prove extremely useful. A lot of specialist terminology, so really good glossary creation is incredibly important, and a lot of institutional language too. So particularly around titles, around governance structures, around ministries, government departments, all that sort of thing. Really important to have a handle on that, because a lot of places you will find there is at least a semi-official, if not official, translation of those sorts of institutions. One thing I also wanted to mention while we're talking about features of text and writing is the use of style guides. And I've certainly found them to be really very, very common in this sector. A few that I might just mention in passing would be the UN editorial manual, which is available online. UNAIDS has its own style guide. The Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development has its own style guide, and they can be really quite extensive. I'm working with the OECD one at the moment, which runs to something like 118 pages. So taking some time before you start a piece of work to see what the style guide says, and try to absorb some of that before you start writing. Really useful, saves a lot of editing later on. And the other aspect, I think, of the documents I get given is that they come with multiple reference documents. So again, there's a lot of material to handle. It can take quite a bit of time before you start the translation, just getting the landscape and finding out where your document fits within that, and where the references might be, because consistency is obviously incredibly important. I just also want to say before, I think it's really handy when starting a piece of work to have some background knowledge of if you're doing a piece on I don't know, food insecurity in Mali, say, it's just sensible, I think, before you get into it to have just read a little bit about location, geographical features, the political situation, recent historical events, key people, and so forth, because some of these things will come up as passing references, and I much prefer to have that some background knowledge under my belt before I start, rather than sort of stopping in the middle of the flow of translation having to go and research some bit of civil unrest or something like that that's just happened. So I think doing a little bit of reading before you get into a text really pays off. Terminological resources are obviously absolutely going to be critical. I've just given a very, very few examples there, of which possibly the most useful actually is the UN term base, which I've given you there, which you can access freely. Specific organisations will have their own. The IMF, for example, has its own term base which you can access. Subject-specific term base is also really useful, just because, you know, smaller in scale and focused on a particular area. So, for example, if you're working in the field of HIV/AIDS, UNAIDS would be the place to go. If you're thinking about gender equality, there's one here for UN, produced by UN Women, would be incredibly useful. But also institutional term bases. So the Global Fund to fight AIDS, malaria, and TB, for example, has its own term base, which again is easily accessed by anyone. But I wouldn't neglect either the glossaries you create from all the reading that you've done about the sector. They will be equally useful as some of these other more broadly available ones. It's always important to remember, I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted, that as a translator, you're a writer as much as you're a translator. So it's obviously incredibly important that you think about your audience, and that really can vary quite a lot in this sector. It could be a specialist audience, for example. If I'm translating a funding application, that's going to go to a panel of people who are going to assess that application, report back on it, ask more questions about it, and so forth. So they're going to have a very good knowledge of the field. But it could be just people with an interest in the field, or it could be the general public. If it's a press release going on a development bank website, that could be literally anyone. So it's just helpful to bear in mind who you're writing for. And also bear in mind, even if people are specialists, it's quite possible that they won't be a native speaker of your target language, and therefore it's important to try to think about that in advance in terms of how you structure your sentences and so forth, so that they are perhaps more straightforward than if you were confident you were writing for a specialist who was a native speaker of that language. I've given you lots of reading suggestions in the previous resources, but I think it's also really helpful to be able to read some institutional documents, because those are the sorts of documents and texts that development professionals are going to be reading. And there's a lot, again, available online. If I take as an example the African Development Bank, so they publish in English, French, Portuguese, and Arabic, huge repository of documents published on their website. So from board documents to environmental and social assessments, to policy documents, to strategy documents, evaluation reports, and all sorts of things, alongside website content, press releases, and so forth. I think reading these is really useful because it gets you into the language that these organisations use and expect to hear reflected back to them in the translations you produce. But also because you've got this ability, if you've got the right language combination, you can use them as parallel texts. So there's no reason you shouldn't take an extract and translate it for yourself and then compare it with the other language version. And you can learn a lot from doing that and making the adjustments that you see are appropriate. Proofreaders can be an absolute boon in this area if they're more experienced than you and are really excellent. I know not everyone is, but many are. Then really taking the time to scrutinise those final versions of your text will only help you improve as you go forward. So really helpful. It's too good. That's feedback that's too good to waste, in my view. And perhaps setting up a revision club. I know that's an idea that quite a few people use, with one or two trusted colleagues in the field, just so you can learn from each other. Just want to touch briefly on the role of translation technologies. I'm conscious I've got maybe 5 minutes or so to go. As I said earlier, these tend to be very high volume projects, and they lend themselves often very well. The types of documents we translate in this sector lend themselves well to the use of translation memories, term bases, and even machine translation. So very high volume, with consistency being absolutely essential. Very often the documents I'm translating will be one of a series that's been running for years. So the quarterly report on food insecurity, for example. So it's incredibly important that you're consistent from one to the next, to the next, to the next, and that's where the technology can be very useful. Deadlines are often tight. For two reasons, that from the sorts of documents I see, if we're going through, say, a funding round, that window may only be open for a few weeks, and so there'll be lots and lots of documentation coming through quickly with tight and hard deadlines. There's not a lot of flexibility there. So again, the technology can help speed up the process, actually, and very often because of the volumes and the times. I find myself working collaboratively with other translators, and so being able to share a memory and a term base as we're all working on the same or a similar set of documents is incredibly helpful. We also see multiple roles coming up in that process. So I might be translating one day, I could be revising somebody else's translation another, I could be finalising that document on the third day, and post-editing is undoubtedly playing a role, and often I have to say, with you working with people who really understand what they're doing and working with specialised engines, actually the results are very good, and it's not like starting from scratch. I know sometimes people feel that would be easier, but I'm not sure that's always fair as a characterisation. It's a multi-stage process, therefore, and in which you may play different roles. It's just maybe worth bearing in mind that it may not suit you if you're the sort of person who'd like to see a document through from beginning to end, because it tends to be that I'll do a translation and I pass it to the next person. Terminology databases, I think I've probably touched on. I think it's also just worth being aware that if you're using the technology, I certainly find it helpful to be using multiple tools, because I have different clients who have different requirements, and so a familiarity with more than one tool, I think is very useful. I said I would touch on sort of challenges and rewards, and I do want to emphasise that I do find this a very rewarding area of work, but actually I note in my slide I've probably written more challenges, and I'll just sort of start with those. I think there is a level of personal investment sometimes in this work. Sometimes you are dealing with areas of work that can be a bit distressing, to be honest. So particularly I have found in working on documents that involve human rights. I've done work on child trafficking, and a particular series of documents a few years ago now on female genital mutilation. Those are not easy topics to spend your day with, and I think it's just worth being aware of what your own boundaries are as to where you feel comfortable. I think it needs really good technical knowledge and terminological knowledge. I'd say actually that there's nothing fluffy about this sector. It requires the same level of rigour as legal translation or technical translation or financial translation, and that it brings to mind for me a comment a project manager made to me some years ago now, to a group of us, saying that actually it is the quality of the translation is really important, because the decisions that get made on the back of it actually affect people's lives, and therefore actually having that, really making sure you are absolutely properly accurate and that you write properly and write in a way that will be persuasive for people making that decision, I think is really, really important. I've touched on workload and deadlines, and that can be, say, workloads can be heavy and deadlines can be tight, so that's just worth bearing in mind that might be something to think about when deciding whether you want to work in this sector. And you do need that willingness to work with extensive reference materials as well. I think it's really important you keep a level of detail. For example, if you're dealing with malaria, you'll be thinking about vectors and species and vector control and treatment regimes, but also trying to maybe take a step back and keep an eye on that wider geo-economic, socio-political context as well. We touched earlier on keeping up to date and the speed of change and the potentially overwhelming array of resources. So those are all the challenges that I feel exist. But what I would say is it's really meaningful work. There are lots of opportunities for learning and plenty of scope for expanding into related fields. And the last thing I probably would say is just I find it really rewarding and interesting. And if I get to the end of a working day where I feel I've done something useful, then that's a good day. And that's part of the reason why I enjoy working in this sector and hope to continue to do so. I think that's about all I want to say formally. But I hope we've got sort of generous 10 minutes for questions. So if there are any, Suhaila, I'll be very happy to try and answer them.
Sure, Karen, thank you so much. So we have had a few questions that have come in, so we'll start with those. But if there are obviously other questions, if you could post them as soon as possible, just so obviously we've got time to go through all of them. Right, so to start with, someone has asked, please could you go a bit more into parallel texts, honing one's writing skills? If the aim is to improve one's work by translating a text that already has an official translation and comparing my work with that official version, where would I typically find such texts? Would it just be a question of going to the websites of organisations that have a web copy in my language pairs?
Broadly speaking, yeah, I think that's right. That's how I would use the term parallel text. So we looked, for example, earlier at, I mentioned rather, the Sustainable Development Goal website of the United Nations. So there, for example, you will find lots and lots and lots of information about that particular topic in multiple languages. So if you are fortunate enough that one of your texts, one of your languages is a UN official language, or two of them actually are, then that's a really good way of just saying, right, I'll take that particular text, I'll do a sample of it in my own time, and then I can compare it with that official version and think, okay, so where have I maybe missed a bit of terminology, or where have I structured something in a different way? It's not that you're trying to necessarily match that official version, because you probably won't be able to do that, but you might be able to look at that other language version and say, okay, well, there are stylistic features or terminological features or ways of phrasing things that I could usefully build into how I write. So just to give you a very simple example, if you're talking about a remote area of a country, you might in everyday language just refer to that as an area that's difficult to access, and that would be it. Semantically, that's giving you the right translation, but you probably in documents of that kind see them referred to as hard to reach areas. So in some sense means the same thing, but what people are used to seeing would be the latter, not the former. So small examples like that, I think it helps you to get into that, just get into the flow of how people write about these sorts of issues.
Okay, thank you. Is there a free tool that will help you find parallel and comparative texts that you know of?
Not that I'm aware of. So I think it would be a case of going online, going to the websites of the larger organisations to start with, because the quality of their translations will probably be very good. But I'm not aware of a particular tool to source them. It would be a really brilliant idea if somebody could develop one, I have to say, but I'm not aware of one, no.
Okay. Are there any glossaries of acronyms from global sectors, or could you perhaps recommend any?
I'd probably say go to the UN term base as a starting point, because that's very, very broad. And that would be my first point. But then again, then going to institutions, so things like funding organisations, development agencies, organisations like the Global Fund, and go for there, because you'll have some that are are relatively broad, but also some that are incredibly specific. I think the ones I find most challenging are the ones that are sort of used within a particular country, but not widely used elsewhere. And that can take a bit of detective work sometimes. After a while, you'll probably start to think, well, if I've got this 6-7 letter acronym and I know the field I'm talking about and I've got the context in the sentence, I can have quite a good stab at finding it, just by putting in some keywords around it. That's often a way of doing it. I think the other challenge we have, certainly the documents I see, is that the acronyms used in my French language document are not necessarily all French. So because actually I'll quite often find English ones put in there as well. So it can take a bit of detective work, and that's why I think it's incredibly important then to build up your own glossaries, because I never want to have to look up an acronym twice, to be honest, because it does take quite a lot of time.
Sure. Okay, thank you. Which sources do you think would most likely offer work from English or French into German? German not being one of the classic languages in international development.
And I'm not honestly equipped to answer that, because I don't work in that language combination at all, I'm afraid. I think that's probably a matter of reaching out to colleagues who do translate into German in this sector and speaking to them.
Okay, thank you. Does translation of international development involve a lot of legal translation?
I would say not in my experience. Occasionally I've been asked to do bits of extracts from legislation, I suppose I get sometimes. Occasionally whole rafts of legislation, but no, not in my experience.
Let me just go through, quite a few questions have come in. So where is the best place to look for translation opportunities in this sector? Is there a guide that one can consult to identify the sources for the institutions in the sector?
I'm not aware of a particular publication, no. My work has tended to come through specialist LSPs, and that either people have approached me or I've hunted them down myself on the internet, simply by typing in international development translation and coming up with some answers there. I think once you start though reading around the sector, if you go back to some of those introductory courses I mentioned, you're going to start coming up with a list of organisations that are involved among those key actors. And so maybe then from there you can start building up a list of possible people. It depends also what kind of client you want to work for. I enjoy working for larger international organisations through language service providers. That's the kind of work I like. I know other people who are successful working for a range of, say, non-governmental organisations, which would be independent and much smaller. And there again, I think it's a matter of saying, okay, well, the sector I'm really interested in is, say, women's rights. And so you do your research around women's rights for organisations in the particular countries in which you're interested, and you take it from there. So it depends where you want to be in the sector. There's obviously in the latter a great deal more work around marketing your skills to those people. But if that's this kind of client you prefer, then that's absolutely worth doing, because I think that gives you the chance to develop a relationship with that small organisation and to just get much more involved in what they're doing. So that it absolutely has its rewards as well.
Sure. Okay. And someone else has asked, they've said, my experience of the sector is that rates are low. I have therefore not been able to dedicate a lot of time to those clients, even though I also find it very rewarding. In your opinion, is it worth pursuing and finding different clients in the sector?
I take the point that it's probably not as well paid as say, financial or legal work. I, as ever, would say it's perhaps worth focusing not so much on the word rate, which is still, I think, an ongoing sticky question in this profession. I think it depends what your focus is, to be honest. Yeah, it's not, I don't think it is the best paid sector. For me, it's worthwhile because I really, really enjoy the work, and I find it actually much more interesting than some other areas of work. So that's a compromise I'm prepared to make for me personally, but other people may not be.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Karen. Someone else has asked, can you recommend a source for translation on gender equality, French to English?
I'd probably look at UN Women as a start and go from there. So the UN Women website, they have lots and lots of materials on gender equality. I'd also look at, yeah, in terms of actual translation, that's probably right. If you're wanting to read more about gender equality generally, or learn more about it, I'm sure there are courses around on things like the Coursera and so forth about that. But I'd start with UN Women.
Okay, thanks. Someone else has asked, I'd love to hear more about the connection between translation, education and international development. What types of materials would you translate that are directly related to promoting access to education, for example?
Again, it would probably be project-based reports, I would say. So if there's an intervention to improve school enrollment ratios for girls in a particular country, for example, that might be an example of the sort of work you would do. So probably around sort of either an application for funding for a project like that, or the sort of monitoring and evaluation reports that would come part way through and at the end of it. That would be the sorts of thing I think would be most common for that particular aspect of translation.
Okay. And let me just check the time. Okay, so we've got a couple of minutes. Someone else has commented that they often interpret for NGOs in this area, and it's common to have issues regarding interpreting cultural equivalence and lack of, for example, the need to explain what food insecurity means in Francophone African situation, near starvation. Sorry, bear with me. Is this an issue for your translation work at all?
It tends not to be, because I'm generally working for larger organisations. So I'm writing for people who are at one remove from that, actually. So it tends to be quite, the documents I'm working on are probably quite technical, rather than focused at that sort of personal, individual level. But I think it's a really interesting point, and it goes back to what I was saying about personal investment and the fact that this can be, there is an abstraction of language. So if you're saying that a country is in food insecurity, a level of food insecurity described as stressed or crisis, that maybe doesn't bring home the reality of that situation to the extent it's going to be, as you say, if actually what you're observing in an interpretive situation is somebody who's actually hungry on the ground in front of you. I take the point that could be very challenging.
Okay, and then just the last question. So someone said that they've been working in this area for a long time, but into French, so they're really enjoying it. But they're finding, however, that increasingly agencies and direct clients do not have the linguistic awareness to distinguish between poor and good translations. Do you know if others have found this to be a problem, or is it less of an issue when working into English?
I haven't found it to be an issue, but that is because, again, it's to do with my client base, and the people I work for have very high standards and care a great deal about the quality of their work. So it's maybe a matter of looking for different clients with a different emphasis, who actually really care about what they do. I'm lucky enough to have worked for a long time with people who actually do really care about the quality of the output.
All right. Well, Karen, thank you so much. That was such an insightful talk, and I'm sure our listeners have found it to be very useful. So just before I close the webinar, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today and for all your questions. And I think I will close the webinar now. So thanks again, Karen.
Thanks, Suhaila.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.